This is one of the most significant cases that the justices have decided in recent years. Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government. Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January. Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis. So they're deciding, even though it's a significant case now, because of course this has enormous implications. So as we go through this opinion now with our team, another outstanding question is what now happens to all that revenue.
What's up, people? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast. Sit down. A federal judge just ordered the Trump administration to give back $175 billion. Not a fine, not a penalty, a refund of tariff money collected from businesses across the country under a regime the court has now ruled illegal. This isn't a sternly worded footnote. This is a judge looking at the Treasury Department and saying, give it back. That
had been collected. This is something, it really wasn't clear from the arguments what they would say about that, if they're going to lay out a plan. So we will continue to go through this, but this is an enormous decision and a rare loss for President Trump before this conservative court.
This is, Paula, a major slap at the President of the United States, who has made a major effort over these many, many months to impose all of these tariffs. And just to look at some of the background I have here, over these many months, the administration has collected $150 billion in these tariffs. So what happens to that money? Do they have to refund that money to the firms, to the people who paid for those tariffs?
That's one of the big questions that came up at arguments, and it's something that we're looking through now in this opinion. The top line is that these are illegal, that the president cannot rely on this 1977 emergency law to impose tariffs.
All of it. The number is so large, your brain needs a moment to process the zeros. And the shockwaves are still moving through Washington. That word, illegal, is not my editorializing. It's not hyperbole from a cable news chyron. It is the binding legal conclusion of the United States Supreme Court. The tariffs that Donald Trump placed at the very center of his economic identity, the policy he called his masterpiece.
Without authorization from Congress, because this question is really about the extent of presidential power. And we know in both his terms in office, President Trump has really worked at the edges of what has largely been recognized as executive authority. But in these arguments back in November, they went on for 2.5 hours, it was clear that the justices were skeptical that President Trump could rely on this vague federal law to impose global tariffs. Now, they did appear to likely be willing to decide that these were illegal, but what is not clear, and we haven't gotten to this part of the opinion, is what happens to all that revenue that has been collected by the government. And President Trump has said himself that this is, this is a massive decision for him. So we're waiting for reaction, both from the Justice Department that argued this on his behalf and also from the White House. But we're going to keep going through this, Wolf, to try to see if the justices laid out any plan for what happens to that revenue.
His golden ticket to American prosperity, the thing he bragged about at every single rally and press availability, have been ruled unconstitutional and unlawful. The courts didn't just say they were a bad idea, they said they were against the law. And now, right now, as you're watching this, the machinery of the federal government is being forced to spin in reverse. A portal exists, an actual functional government-operated website where businesses can log in, upload their paperwork, and demand their money back. The checks are being prepared, the refunds are being processed.
All right, Paula, stand by. I know you're going to be reading all these the opinions and everything. I want to get back to you, but I want to bring in our senior legal analyst, Ellie Honig, right now. Ellie, as I said, this is a huge setback for the President of the United States, and this has been a traditionally conservative Supreme Court, but they ruled that all of these tariffs that Trump has imposed over these many months are illegal. It's a big deal.
Well, Wolf, it's a monumental ruling, and the bottom line is that the tariffs Donald Trump announced back in April on Liberation Day are gone. They have been ruled illegal by this U.S. Supreme Court. An interesting array of justices here. In the majority, ruling that the tariffs are illegal is Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, three conservatives who teamed up with the three liberal justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, to rule these tariffs unconstitutional. The dissenters are Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh. And the basis for the ruling is this: Congress, not the president, Congress typically holds the tariff power. Now, Congress passed this law back in 1977 called the International Economic Emergencies Act.
And the man in the Oval Office is absolutely, spectacularly losing his mind over it. Let me paint the full picture for you because you need to grasp the sheer absurdity and the political devastation of this moment. For years, Donald Trump has walked around telling anyone who would listen that tariffs are the answer to every economic question. Tariffs will make us rich. Tariffs will bring back the factories.
And Donald Trump tried to use that law to say, well, I'm declaring an international economic emergency, therefore I'm imposing tariffs. But the majority here said, no, that law does not authorize you to impose tariffs, and no, there is not a valid international economic emergency here. So the end result, and we are still going through this, but the end result is that Donald Trump's tariffs have been struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. But really important point I want to make, Donald Trump has said, various White House officials have said, if he loses on this basis, he will try to re-implement other tariffs through other laws, which he can try to do. However, those other laws are much more restrictive. They would not allow him to apply the type of sweeping, massive, across the globe tariffs that he tried to impose here, but have now been struck down. Look, Donald Trump said these tariffs are the single most important thing he has done in his presidency. He said that, and now they've been struck down by the court.
Tariffs are the greatest thing ever invented. He slapped them on allies, on adversaries, on anyone who dared to sell something to American consumers. He used a dusty old emergency powers statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short, to bypass Congress entirely and impose sweeping global taxes on imported goods with the stroke of a pen. He called it America First.
So you're right. The administration has made clear that if the court strikes this down, that they'll look at other tariff authorities to use. But bottom line here, Ellie, how big of a mess does this ruling create, given the fact that the administration says it has already received $150 billion in revenue, largely paid for by American businesses? Do they get a refund? What happens now?
Yeah, so it's hard to think of a case that has broader implications politically and legally and economically than this one. I know a lot of people are watching for this one. We don't yet have the answer. This was a question that came up during the oral argument. Amy Coney Barrett in particular asked the lawyers, well, what do we do with the $100+ billion that have already been paid by American importers, by American manufacturers? We're going to look carefully at this. I know Paul is reading this very carefully, but that's a huge question. Will there be some sort of mass refund program? Will the court rule that the tariffs are dead from here on out, but there are no repayments? We will let you know as soon as we get an answer to that one.
All right. As you noted, Paula has been reading through the opinion. I want to go back to Paula Reed because
he said other countries would foot the bill, and a lot of people believed him. They cheered. They said, finally, a president who fights for us. The tariffs became more than just policy. They became the central pillar of the Trump economic mythology. They were the proof that he was a different kind of leader, a disruptor who didn't play by the old broken rules. They were everywhere, in his speeches, in his ads, in his social media feed.
We know that 3 conservatives sided with the liberals on the court, and you have a quote from one of those conservatives, right, Paula?
That's right. Well, this is Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion where the court agreed 6-3 that President Trump's tariffs exceed his power under the law. He wrote, quote, "The president asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth, history, and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it." And we knew that the Chief Justice would be a key vote after what we saw at arguments. Now, we are still going through this. I want to show you, this is about a third of the opinion. It's 170 pages long. This is just a fraction of it. Wow. So we're going through it very carefully to try to understand what, if anything, the court said.
And then the judiciary branch of the United States government woke up and decided to read the actual Constitution. And what they found was a problem. A big one. The Supreme Court, the very institution that Trump spent years reshaping with his own appointees, looked at the IEEPA tariff scheme and essentially said, "What are you doing? This is not what emergency powers are for."
About what happens to all that revenue the government has already collected. I know that's a big question. Right now, we are carefully going through this to see if they laid out a plan, if this goes back to the lower courts. That's what we're working to figure out right now.
And a quick question from me, Paula. Do the tariffs immediately go away as of right now, or does it take a few days or at least maybe a few weeks for them to be removed?
Well, they've been declared by the Supreme Court to be illegal. So we're going through to see if they laid out some sort of plan. But as of right now, people should not have to pay a tariff today or tomorrow, one would think. But we're looking to see, because the logistics of this are so complicated, to see if the justices waded into that, or if all of that is going to be something that's now going to be tossed down to lower courts now that the justices have ruled on the larger constitutional question here, the separation sort of powers and who has the authority to do this, right? Because while this has enormous economic implications, really this was a question about the extent of executive power. We know President Trump really plays at the edges of that. And again, this is a rare loss for President Trump since he has returned to office before this conservative court. So we're going to keep waiting through what they said to work out the details.
They didn't issue a gentle suggestion. They didn't ask for a revised proposal. They struck it down. They incinerated the legal foundation upon which the entire global tariff structure was built. They said the president misused his authority. They said he invented a massive new tax system out of thin air without a single vote in the people's house. They said, in the dry, precise language of the law, that this was illegal. Can you imagine the rage? Can you imagine the sheer volcanic fury of watching the court you packed with your own judges turn around and gut your signature achievement? But the Supreme Court ruling was just the opening act of this legal horror show. The ruling said the tariffs were illegal, but it didn't automatically open the Treasury vaults. It didn't say exactly how the money would find its way back to the people it was taken from. That job fell to a federal trade judge named Richard Eaton. And Judge Eaton was not in the mood for delays. He wasn't interested in the administration's pleas for patience or their warnings about administrative chaos. He looked at the calendar, looked at the law, and ordered the government to start processing refunds immediately. Start doing the accounting. Start cutting the checks. Get moving. And in a moment of pure, unvarnished judicial clarity that deserves to be framed, Judge Eaton looked at the government's lawyers and essentially said, "Don't tell me this is impossible. We live in the age of computers." That's right. In the year 2026, the federal government tried to argue that figuring out who paid what was just too complicated, too burdensome, too hard. And the judge laughed them out of the room. "Use the computers," he said. "That's what they're for." And so, under the cold, hard stare of a court order, the gears of the federal bureaucracy began to grind in a direction they have never moved before. The government launched a portal, a digital intake system called CAPE, the Consolidated Administration and Processing of Entries, where businesses can log in and file their refund claims. This isn't theoretical. This isn't a draft proposal. This is live. As of this week, tens of thousands of companies have already signed up. The queue is forming, and the total exposure for the United States Treasury, up to $175 billion. Let that number marinate for a second. $175 billion. That's not a fine. That's not a settlement. That's a refund. That's the government saying, we took your money under a law that didn't actually exist, and now we have to give it back. And Donald Trump is absolutely beside himself. He's calling the courts anti-American. He's claiming the process will take years and years to sort out, as if that makes the legal defeat less humiliating. He went on a full-blown televised rant, the kind where the veins in his neck start to look like a roadmap of West Virginia. And in a move that is so perfectly, predictably Trumpian, it almost writes itself. The very same day the Supreme Court crushed his IEEPA tariffs, he announced a brand new 10% global tariff under a completely different legal provision. Because if at first you get ruled illegal by the highest court in the land, just find a different statute and try the exact same thing again. That's the strategy. That's the plan. But here's the brutal, inescapable reality that he cannot spin his way out of. The damage is done. The money was already collected. The prices were already raised. The economic disruption already happened. And now the process of unwinding it all, of giving back the cash, has officially begun. The portal is open. The claims are being filed. The checks are being prepared. In this video, we are going to dissect every single layer of this unfolding catastrophe. We're going to walk through the exact legal mechanics of what happened in that courtroom. We're going to put that $175 billion figure into real-world context so you understand just how massive this financial boomerang really is. And we're going to explore what this means for the carefully crafted image of Donald Trump as the ultimate economic dealmaker, the guy who was supposed to know how to make money, not how to lose it and get sued for it. This isn't just a legal story about tariff codes and trade law. This is a political story about a man whose entire brand is colliding with a wall of judicial reality. And honestly, this is one of the wildest, most satisfying examples of accountability we have covered in a very, very long time. So buckle up. All right, let's rewind the tape and go back to the very beginning of this saga, because to truly appreciate the magnitude of this judicial smackdown, you have to understand the sheer audacity of what Trump was attempting to do with these tariffs in the first place. And I mean really understand it, not just the surface-level headlines, but the full, unvarnished picture. Trump entered his second term with a singular obsession: tariffs. He saw them as a universal hammer, and every trading partner as a nail waiting to be pounded. China, Europe, Canada, Mexico, South Korea. It didn't matter. If you made something and shipped it to America, Trump wanted to tax it. His theory was straightforward and on a bumper sticker level somewhat appealing. Make imported goods more expensive, and American companies will be forced to manufacture things here at home. The jobs return, the smokestacks light up, and America becomes a gleaming industrial powerhouse once more. That's the sales pitch. And to be clear, the concept of using tariffs as a tool of trade policy is not inherently insane. Countries have used targeted tariffs for decades to protect specific industries or counter unfair subsidies. But that's not what this was. The issue was never the what of the tariffs. The issue was the how. And the how is where Trump drove a bulldozer through the Constitution. He didn't go to Congress. He didn't negotiate a trade bill. He didn't use the established legal pathways that exist precisely for this kind of major economic restructuring. Instead, he reached into the legal toolbox and pulled out a rusted, obscure wrench called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. He dusted it off, declared a national economic emergency regarding the trade deficit, and claimed that this declaration gave him the unilateral, king-like authority to slap massive taxes on virtually everything entering the country. Think about the arrogance of that move. One man, one signature, no debate, no vote, no public hearings, just a declaration that because he said it was an emergency, he could bypass the legislative branch of the United States government entirely. And it worked, for a while. Businesses had no choice. You can't argue with a Customs and Border Protection officer at the Port of Long Beach about the constitutionality of an executive order. You either pay the duty or your container full of electronics rots on the dock. So they paid, and they paid, and they kept paying. The Treasury Department watched the money roll in by the billions. According to the court filings, by the time the Supreme Court finally weighed in, an estimated 330,000 importers had paid somewhere around $166 billion in duties just under this specific EPA scheme. And the whole time, Trump was out on the stump on social media in the Rose Garden bragging, "Look at all this revenue. The tariffs are working. We're making so much money." He was treating the U.S. Treasury like his personal lemonade stand, convinced he'd found a cheat code to fund the government without raising taxes on anyone except those foreigners he claimed were paying the bill. Except he missed one tiny, inconvenient detail. Or perhaps he chose to ignore it, betting that the courts would be too slow or too deferential to stop him. The law has limits. Emergency powers are not a blank check for a president to remake the entire global economic order on a whim, and eventually the courts were going to look at this, and when they did, the whole thing was going to come crashing down. And the David who slew this Goliath, it wasn't a massive multinational conglomerate with a war chest of lobbyists. It was a small educational toy company, a business called Learning Resources. Their CEO, a man named Rick Woldenberg, looked at the tariffs that were crushing his margins and threatening his employees' livelihoods and decided to sue the President of the United States. That lawsuit, that little David and Goliath gamble, wound its way through the federal judiciary, climbing rung by rung until it landed on the doorstep of the highest court in the land. And on that fateful day in February, the Supreme Court delivered a verdict that was less of a ruling and more of a legal execution. They said Trump's use of IEEPA to impose these sweeping global tariffs was illegal. They said you cannot use a statute designed for dealing with unusual and extraordinary threats from foreign actors to create a permanent worldwide tax regime without Congress. The court, packed with conservative justices who owed their jobs to Trump and his movement, looked at the evidence and said, "No, this went too far. We will not permit this." Now, here is where a lot of the initial news coverage dropped the ball and where the confusion set in. The Supreme Court ruling was a declaration of illegality. It was the judge saying, "You broke the law." But it was relatively silent on the specific remedy. It didn't say, "And now here is exactly how you process the refunds." Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in a moment of understated foreshadowing, wrote separately to note that the refund process would likely be a mess. And Trump, seizing on that ambiguity, immediately tried to run out the clock. He stood before the press and said, essentially, "Well, I guess this has to be litigated for the next 2 years, maybe 5 years. Who knows? It's a mess." He was trying to bury the refunds in procedural quicksand, hoping that businesses would give up or that the political calendar would change. But Judge Richard Eaton of the Court of International Trade wasn't playing that game. He stepped in and said, "We are not waiting 5 years. We are not waiting 5 months." He ordered Customs and Border Protection to start the refund process immediately. He ordered them to stop applying the illegal charges to pending shipments. And when the government's lawyers started whining about how complex and difficult the accounting would be, Judge Eaton delivered the line that should be carved into the courthouse wall. We live in the age of computers. Translation, you have spreadsheets, you have algorithms, you have the entire might of the federal IT infrastructure. Figure it out. Now, the Trump administration tried one more stall tactic. They ran to the federal appeals court and begged for a 90-day pause. They wanted a timeout. The appeals court looked at the request and denied it flat. No pause. Keep moving. And so, with its back against the wall and a court order burning a hole in its pocket, the government launched the CAPE portal, an actual real-life website where businesses can go to file claims against the government for taking their money illegally. As of this moment, approximately 5,500 companies have registered to receive refunds, and the total potential liability for the United States government sits at that staggering $175 billion figure. Let's pause and let that number echo for a moment. $175 billion. That is a seismic financial event. That's not an accounting correction, that's an economic earthquake. And here is the part that nobody in the pro-tariff camp wants to talk about. The part that exposes the entire China pays narrative as a complete and total fabrication. This money came from somewhere, and it didn't come from Beijing, despite every single rally speech, every single tweet, every single promise that foreign countries would foot the bill. The data tells a very different story. A comprehensive study from the New York Federal Reserve found that as of late last year, roughly 90% of the tariff burden was being absorbed right here at home by American businesses paying higher import costs and by American shoppers paying higher prices at the cash register. Not Chinese factory owners, not European bureaucrats, us, American firms, American families. So let's connect the dots. Not only were the tariffs ruled unconstitutional and illegal by the Supreme Court, but they were also being paid almost entirely by the very people Trump claimed he was protecting. That is the story. That is the two-punch combination that should make everyone's jaw hit the floor. And now, some of the bigger, more consumer-facing companies are pledging to pass those refunds back down the line. FedEx has made noises about returning money to customers. Costco has hinted at similar moves. But here is the brutal, fine-print reality that is going to infuriate regular people. The CAPE portal is only for the importer of record. It's for the business that actually cut the check to Customs and Border Protection. It's not for you. It's not for the family that paid an extra $15 for a pair of sneakers or an extra $200 for a new appliance. If your favorite brand raised its prices because of the tariffs and now gets a massive refund check from the government, you might not see a single penny of that money. Not unless that company, out of the goodness of its corporate heart, decides to voluntarily issue credits or lower prices. And let's be honest about how often that happens. Some will pocket the windfall. They'll book it as profit, and the executives will get a nice bonus. The average American consumer, the person who actually bore the economic pain of these illegal taxes, is likely going to be left holding the bag. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how the legal structure of this specific refund mechanism is built. Now, to be fair and balanced, this refund refund process is not a magic money button that instantly deposits billions back into the economy. It's a slow, bureaucratic grind. Businesses have to apply. They have to prove they paid the specific IEPA duties. And right now, only unliquidated entries, meaning tariffs that haven't been finalized for more than about 80 days, are eligible for the first wave of refunds. Not every dollar that was ever collected under IEPA is coming back in phase 1. And the administration is fighting this every single step of the way. They are expected to appeal Judge Eaton's refund order. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has already gone on the record predicting that the full process will drag on for months, if not years. They are going to slow walk this thing as much as the judiciary will allow them to. They will file motions. They will seek clarifications. They will do everything in their power to delay the moment when those checks actually hit the mail. But the direction of travel is now set in stone. The legal precedent is established. The portal is live. The machine is moving. And while this is all unfolding, while the refund claims are piling up, Donald Trump is not sitting quietly in the residence, reflecting on the limits of executive power. Oh no, he is erupting. He is raging against the anti-American courts. He is screaming into the void about judicial overreach. And on the very same day, the Supreme Court gutted his IEPA tariffs. He signed an executive order imposing a brand new 10% global tariff under a completely different legal authority, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. It's the policy equivalent of watching a kid get told he can't play with one toy, so he immediately grabs a different toy and insists it's the same thing. He is signaling to his base and to the world that this fight is far from over. He will rebuild the wall brick by brick, even if he has to use a different brand of mortar. But here is the political reality that is staring him right in the face, and it's a reality that no amount of alternative legal theories can erase. The signature policy of his second term, the policy that was supposed to be his crowning economic achievement, has been ruled illegal by the highest court in the nation. The revenue it generated may have to be returned en masse to the private sector, and the central promise that foreigners would pay has been exposed as a complete myth. That is a very, very hard story to spin. That is the kind of story that leaves a permanent scar on a political legacy. Okay, so let's distill this down into clear, digestible points because there is a lot of legal and economic fog swirling around this story. And I want to make sure we are all crystal clear on what just happened. The tariffs were ruled illegal, full stop. There is no gray area here. This isn't a matter of interpretation or a difference of opinion on trade policy. The United States Supreme Court, the final arbiter of what is and is not constitutional in this country, looked at the way Trump used IEPA and said, that is not what this law is for. Emergency powers do not grant the executive branch the authority to unilaterally rewrite the entire global tax code. Congress did not authorize this. The American people did not vote for this specific sweeping mechanism. Therefore, it is illegal. That is a monumental ruling. The Supreme Court does not casually slap down a sitting president's signature economic policy. This was a historic rebuke of executive overreach. $175 billion is not a talking point. It's a financial avalanche. We need to put this number in perspective. The entire annual budget for the Department of Homeland Security is roughly in the ballpark of $60 to $70 billion. The budget for the entire State Department and foreign aid is around $60 billion. We are talking about a refund exposure that could exceed the combined annual budgets of multiple major cabinet agencies. This is real money that the government counted on and now has to give back. And remember, this money was already spent or factored into deficit projections. Forcing the Treasury to disgorge $100 to $175 billion adds directly to the national debt. It makes the fiscal picture significantly worse. And the irony is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Trump sold this policy as a revenue generator, a way to make the country rich. Instead, it's turning into a massive liability that future generations of taxpayers will have to cover. The American consumer got fleeced and likely won't get made whole. This is the part that should genuinely make people's blood boil. The New York Fed's data confirms that the cost of these tariffs was passed almost entirely onto American businesses and American households. We paid more for clothes, for tools, for food, for electronics. And now that the courts have ordered refunds, the legal pathway for that money only goes back to the corporate importers. There is no mechanism, zero, for the average citizen to file a claim for the extra $50 they spent on a lawnmower or the extra 20 cents they paid for a can of soup. Some companies, the ones with consumer-facing brands to protect, might voluntarily share the refund. Most won't. They'll treat it as a windfall recovery of an unexpected expense. So the ordinary American paid the tax and now watches the corporation get the refund. That's the system at work. The Trump economic brand has been gut-punched. This is why he is so loud right now. This is why the eruptions are so volcanic. Donald Trump's entire political persona is built on the myth of the ultimate winner, the master dealmaker who knows how to make the economy roar. He put tariffs at the absolute center of that narrative. And now, the highest court in the land has said his signature move was illegal. A judge is forcing him to give the money back. A government website exists solely to process claims against his own policy. Every single refund check that gets printed is a physical, tangible piece of evidence that he failed, that he overreached, that he was wrong, and he knows it. That's why he's calling the court's names instead of defending the policy on its merits. That's why he's scrambling to find a legal workaround. He cannot let this stand as the final chapter of his trade war. But the refunds are moving forward anyway. The portal is open. The claims are accumulating. And while all of this plays out, while the checks are being cut, Donald Trump is already trying to build the next iteration of the tariff wall. He's trying different laws, different emergency declarations, different justifications. The question is no longer whether he will keep fighting. He will. He always does. The question is, how much more economic chaos can the country absorb before the whole experiment collapses under its own weight? How many more billions in refunds will be ordered? How much more legal credibility will the executive branch burn through? This story is far from over. In fact, the next chapter is already being written in a different courtroom, and it makes this $175 billion refund look like a warm-up act. You do not want to miss what's coming next. Stay locked in.